I know it's very easy for us to think of these people as psychopaths or, very violent and crazy people, but they're not. I mean, there are people that are motivated by this strong belief that, they live in an unjust world and they want to change that.
Most people can remember exactly where they were or what they did when the terror attacks from 9/11 took place in 2001. Since then, nearly 60,000 research papers with the term terrorism in their titles have been published. If we expand our search to include in-text searches in Google Scholar over the same period, we are met with an astonishing 2 million papers. But despite the substantial volume, the field of terrorism and counterterrorism studies has to deal with significant shortcomings. One indication that this field is in trouble is the fact that only 34% of terrorism research has managed to produce any new data. The majority of papers are simply regurgitating pre-existing information. A notable exception is, as you will see, my guest in the following interview. Another reason behind the rather bleak state of terrorism research is related to the influence wielded by those who control the research funding, because often they are driven by their own political agendas and conflicting interests. At this point, it's probably worth noting that the multi-billion-dollar industry has a vested interest in perpetuating a never-ending war on terror. So instead of addressing the true underlying root causes of terrorism, what has happened is the generalized labeling of terrorists as bad, sad, or crazy. This, by the way, is the title of a research paper I've written a couple of years ago, a paper that to this day remains unpublished because it goes against the very interests that profit from this war on terror. But as you will discover in this interview, terrorists are not inherently bad, sad, or crazy. My guest today, Sagit Yehoshua, is an Israeli scientist and a criminal and terrorism profiler with virtually hundreds of face-to-face interviews with individuals that the State of Israel deemed to be terrorist leaders. Most of these interviews took place in Israel's high-security jails, and some of Sagit's findings might surprise you. Now, I do realize that this interview may not be suitable for everyone, but if you're interested in security, in terrorism or profiling, or in the complex dynamics in Israel, it might be well worth your time. So for now, let's turn our attention to the insights that Sagit, with her 2-decade-long career, graciously shares with us. And here we go. Sagit, thank you so much for joining today. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. How are you?
Thank you. I'm happy now that we have connected here. Once that hurdle is passed, then everything will be fine. Okay,
Absolutely.
good. Very briefly, we met at a conference not so long ago where we were both speakers. That's the context here. And I have asked you to join my podcast, and you kindly agreed. And here we are.
Mhm.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yes, of course. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. So, out of curiosity, you said to me that yesterday you were in the army. As far as you can tell, I mean, from one day being in the army and the next day being a scientist, how does that go?
Well, my life is very, very diverse and interesting, and that's how I love it. I do work with the Army on a regular basis. I kind of created this method of using profiling, criminal profiling, but in more a security slash terrorism context, which is very, very useful these days. I don't know how much you know about the situation here in Israel, but terrorism here is not a new phenomenon for us. And it's very important to understand, the mindset and behavior of the people that we have to, tackle, that we have to deal with. So I found it very, very useful to be able to help my government and the army to do things better, to to understand how our perpetrators, how terrorists think, how their mindset work, how they make decisions. And in that respect, it helps to, manage the threat and deal with situations that we unfortunately have to deal on a daily basis.
Yeah, and you wrote your PhD thesis, which I have on my screen here. I think it was 10 years ago. Right? I read almost
2013.
all of it. Yeah, it was an interesting
Well
read.
done.
I have I have quite a
Probably you and my supervisor are the only one that did it.
I have the same feeling with my own thesis. I think there are only three people who read it. Yeah, but that's how it goes. Yeah. Nevertheless, it
Yeah, but
was an
I did publish a book later on that combined my PhD thesis with the process that I found in the last 20 years that terrorism has been going through. And I found that when I first started working as a profiler, trying to understand terrorists in prisons, I worked with Hamas, Fatah, Islamic Jihad leaders in prison. It was completely different encounter. The people were completely in a different mindset than the people I found today. I interviewed today in prisons. It's a different generation. It's a different mindset. The grievances are different. The motivations are different, and I found it fascinating. And I think it's really important to understand that we're dealing with a different threat, and there's no point, thinking, because if you're in a security mindset, then sometimes you're very like you have a tunnel vision. You're very limited because, I know terrorism for 20 years, but you need to understand that it's a very dynamic phenomenon and it changes constantly, and you have to be one step ahead. Otherwise, it can be very, very dangerous.
yeah. It's probably worth pointing out that you have interviewed many terrorists captured and which are in Israeli jails, and you have
Yeah.
even made the distinction between, let's say, Hamas and Fatah, I mean secular and religious, and the
Mm.
Islamic Jihad, right? So there are definite differences. Yeah. Now I have a couple of things just to get into this interview. Yeah. And I don't want to make it too theoretical, but I think we can't completely avoid it. I also don't want to make it political, although we can't completely avoid it. It's the very nature of the topic, right? It's not completely possible. Yeah. Now, I would like to start with the fact, and again, that's more of academic interest. Yeah, there is no real definition of terrorism. Yeah, but the moment you go into academics, I mean, even there is no clear definition for intelligence. Right? We do not know actually how to define intelligence, such a fundamental human concept, and the same is true for terrorism.
No, it's true. And I find it very difficult because if you work globally, because I work in Europe and I work in the US as well, and I really need to understand each place where I go, I need to understand how the law is there, how they define terrorism, because otherwise it's very difficult because I need to profile a terrorist. And if it doesn't even consider a terrorist in that specific place, then that's a completely different perception. So it is a bit complicated, but I think that even though there's no specific definition, the general term is quite, people understand it. People understand that it has to be violence, it has to be against civilians, and not completely against the army. And people understand that the motivation has to be related to ideology and to politics, because otherwise what's the point? It's not terrorism, it's
Criminal,
criminals
yeah.
that commit these acts. So I think overall we do understand where is a terrorist act versus criminal acts.
Yeah. I think the differences start when we consider what terrorism is, yeah, because some see it as a symptom of an underlying cause, right, and
Mhm.
others see terrorism as an issue itself. So, what's your own vision?
I think it's kind of both, because it really depends. For me, the motivation is the most important thing. Like, once I understand what motivated that person to commit these specific acts, then I know whether, he's actually a terrorist, or just a low life criminal, or someone that, needs help or is crying for help. Because sometimes these days I can barely find an ideology among all these, perpetrators. They use the ideology as an excuse, to commit these acts, because they do want to empower themselves. They do want to, do something meaningful in their lives. But sometimes I feel like they don't even care about the ideology. They're not really aware, like, properly what it means. And many of them, once they get caught and once they go through that process of interrogations, and they realize what they've done, and they completely realize, that they could have received this empowerment in so many other, different, um, better, ways, rather than doing these acts of terrorism. So
What you
it
just said,
was,
the missing of clear ideology, is this true for both, for Hamas and for Fatah, as of secular and religious? Or?
yes. I mean, today we barely deal with Hamas and Fatah. I mean, most of the incidents we've dealt with in the last year, I would say, the people with barely no affiliations. I mean, individuals that have been, of course, there's a lot of incitements by the organization, of course, but these people have decided by themselves to, commit certain acts. Some of them do, play alliance to ISIL, Daesh. But most of them, they have these incitements. They have all they need, all the fans, all the people around them in, in their iPhone or smartphone. And it seems like nobody needs an organization, nobody needs an affiliation, nobody needs anyone to guide him and fund him and train him. They do it all by themselves. So whether they're secular or religious, they have certain grievances that this acts just give them what they're looking for. And it's mainly empowerment. That's what they're looking for, attention, a lot of them.
I think it's true what you said, that in the last decade or so, the Palestinian population as a whole has lost faith in whatever leadership they are adhering to, right?
Yeah,
And they no longer, that makes it also difficult, yeah, they no longer follow the instructions of their respective leadership, if it's secular or
absolutely.
religious.
Look, the national grievances are still there. I'm not saying that there is ideology in terms of national grievances is gone. I think Israel is one of the only places in the world that we still have this really strong national deprivation among, this group of people, among the Palestinians. It's there. But unfortunately, today, people don't act upon a social deprivation, because nationalism is social deprivations. The people I spoke with 20 years ago, they sacrificed themselves for their people. They sacrificed themselves for the cause, for the for the Palestinian, people. Today, they don't sacrifice themselves for others. They do it, for their own needs and own deprivations and own agenda. And it's completely different. It's like, I feel today that socialism is gone. It's basically individualism today. People are individuals that act for themselves. They use sometimes as an excuse because it sounds much better and much honorable, like, but if you dig deep inside, there's no socialism there. They do it for themselves. And that's the dramatic change that I found between the ideological people I interviewed that have committed horrific acts, yeah, 20 years ago, horrific acts. But the story that they told themselves, they really believe that they're doing it for their people. I don't see it today. I don't see it. I mean, I don't see that ideology um, as it used to be, like 20 years ago.
I don't have the exact numbers, but you maybe know, yeah, in terms of the the volume of terrorist acts, yeah. But if we look at the current situation, right? So since November, Israel has the most right-wing government in its history, right? There were, I think, also the largest protests in Israel's history not so long ago, right? Which you could basically describe as sectarian, split within Israel between the two strands of Judaism, yeah, that struggle for power. And in addition, that's the last of those three. You have the last couple of weeks to months this resurgence of settler violence, right? So in this context, I'm asking you, I mean, in the last period, yeah, do you see an increase of terrorist activities?
I would say, I'll start with a more general term. I think that what happened in the world since the rise of Daesh, it caused a sort of a peak in the other side as well. I mean, as a result of very strong religious, rise of organization, you got a very strong, right wing, anti-government, anti-Semitic, all over the world. You can see it. It's a reaction. Okay, reaction of Daesh cause reaction of the right wing, and we see both of them in a really, really high, values that we didn't see before. And if I take it to Israel, I think that the same thing happens here. The fact that there is a complete despair of any probable solution in the near future, then it caused this reaction of a rise of both sides. Yeah, because the minute one side is rising, there is a reaction on the other side that wants to protect or to control that specific rise. So you will see, whenever there is a rise of terrorism, Palestinian terrorism, you'll see a rise in the, I will say, right wing agenda to try and sort of control and protect that side. And after so many years of of a complete, I would say, isolation and no solution whatsoever, I would say that it caused both sides to decide, you know what, nothing works. Only violent will get us anywhere. And once, Islamic terrorism becomes, or not Islamic, Palestinian terrorism becomes, a bit more frequent, then the settlers and even people in Israel that were, center right or even center, left, you know, escalated their opinions because they see that there's a lot of Palestinian terrorism and say, you know what, we can't find any normal or peaceful solutions, so we need to be stronger against terrorism. And right wing sounds stronger against terrorism, which, as we can see in the last 6 months, they didn't really succeed in controlling and countering the terrorism that we have. But that's how, that's how they present themselves. So people voted, like people voted Hamas. Palestinian voted Hamas from the same reason, because they thought, you know what, Fatah didn't succeed all these years, so maybe Hamas will succeed. They're less corrupted. They're, um, they're presenting us, better. We'll vote for them. Same thing happened in Israeli politics, right? Like left wing, the peace movement is gone. Nobody is succeeding in, promoting any peaceful solutions. Okay, so that's dead. Let's go, to the other solution. And that's what happened. It's really unfortunate, but people less and less believe in any possibility of peaceful resolutions, and that's dramatic. That is really sad.
That's true for both sides, absolutely.
Yeah,
And it's also true
absolutely.
what you said, that the Israeli society has shifted to the right. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the government that's today
Yeah,
in place. Yeah. But if we leave politics to some degree and we go into research, if we start with the psychopathology of terrorists, right? And again, I was very pleased to read in your thesis, um, what also aligned with my own research, right? Because there is no psychopathology, uh, means sickness, mental illness from terrorists. It's just not there. Yeah, I have a whole list of well-known scientists confirming this. Yeah, Atran, Borum, Crenshaw, Horgan,
yeah,
Macaulay, Ilan Pape, even. Yeah, Viktorov. I could go on and on and on. Yeah, there are no traces of a unique terrorist profile that ever materialized. Yeah, psychopathology-based terrorism has been firmly disproven. Yeah. So I'm very happy to see, because that's the easy way out, right? To
yeah.
say
But
those. Please.
I do think that we need to consider today the changes that we see in terrorism. I still don't believe that, we have psychopathology among terrorists. But the terrorists that we are dealing with today, which as far as I'm concerned, are not terrorists, they're criminals. Yeah. But I'm not, the ones that is deciding on how to, you know, to put the laws in place. But I would say that today, the terrorists I speak with are not terrorists because their motivations are not ideological and not political. So, and they have a lot of, dysfunctional mental dysfunction and mental illnesses and personality disorders that I do see a lot. So we need to consider the fact that there is a change, like Daesh. There's not a lot of research um, about Daesh members, in Europe, and but we can definitely see that there is a huge percentage of them that do suffer from different personality disorders and mental illnesses. Absolutely, something we haven't seen before. And the reason is because Daesh, accepted everyone. You know, there was no, if you wanted to be affiliated as a member, you didn't know, go have to go through any tests or, like any problems, like you were just in. Hamas doesn't do that, okay? Even Al Qaeda doesn't do that. Um, in order to be a member, when I spoke with Hamas leaders, they absolutely said, we need someone we can trust. The people we have in our organization needs to be people that if I'm sending him on a mission, I need to know that he's responsible, that he's stable, that he will do it, properly. I can't have people that are mental ills or have different disorder that I can't trust them. Um, so Daesh doesn't do that. Like ISIS doesn't do that. So I'm pretty sure, I mean, we could definitely see individuals like Jihadi John and like, even Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. We can definitely see some really strong personality disorder without even being a criminologist to do that. Um, so there is a shift. But it's not a shift of more terrorists becoming mental ill. It's terrorism has changed, and it's not the same terrorist anymore. It's not the same mindset. It's more a different definition of violent crimes that are committed by people that are using ideology as an excuse to commit these certain acts, but there are no whatsoever ideological driven or working for their society. They're working for themselves. And that's why they're more criminals than terrorists.
I think one could argue, and again, not defending, yeah, one could argue that but you have a lot of I actually had the numbers somewhere. A large population of the Palestinians are under 20, right? Let's just say a growing number of the Palestinian population is under 20. And you know, as a psychologist, and I know from research, that the most dangerous population group in any democracy are young males between 16 and 22. Yeah, for a number of psychological reasons, which are all well researched, right? And if you have these people growing up under circumstances like it's now in Palestine, for example, of course they will develop some psychological issues, of course, right?
Yeah.
So question is the chicken there first, or is the egg the first one? It's a good one, yeah. But coming back to your research, I found another research, and I saw that you actually also referenced him in PhD. It's Ariel Merari, right? He
Yeah.
did a similar research than you did. He had access from 1983 till 2004, also to investigate the kind of the root causes of terrorism. Yeah. And also he came up, yeah, he found none of the risk factors commonly associated with suicide, such as mood disorders, schizophrenia, substance abuse, or a history of suicide attempts. Yeah. So that's matching actually your research, right?
Yeah, 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 absolutely. I mean, Melanie did another research later. We did have in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, we did have a wave of individuals that committed acts by themselves using mostly knives. um, and these groups, it happens for a few months. They're completely suicidal, um, and their profile was completely different. They had mental illnesses, personality disorder, so like a lot of very personal grievances, and we can definitely see how these people are related to the group that are using the circumstances, the situation that they're in order to, that serves the best interest. They want to commit suicide and they will do it in an honorable way. Um, so we need to understand the differences between the people that are, committing these acts out of self grievances versus the ones that are committing them out of social grievances or social national grievances. We do have, if we look at the leaders, for example, Yahya Sinwar, who is one of the leaders, the main leader of Hamas in Gaza, okay? Or if we look at Nasrallah, that is the leader of Hezbollah, yeah? He's like, um, these, like, Nasrallah is more than 20 years, like this very charismatic leader. The same thing with Sinwar, very charismatic leader. Um, if we look at them, they're motivated by mostly ideology. They really, really care about the Palestinian cause. I mean, Sinwar, about the Palestinian cause. Um, and you can see his, grievances and his motivations are not, I know it's very easy for us to think of these people as psychopaths or, like very violent and crazy people, but they're not. I mean, there are people that are motivated by this strong belief that, they live in an unjust world and they want to change that. But unfortunately, today, I mean, I don't see many that sharing the same ideology. It's mostly people that are completely deprived personally, and I think that the ones that truly believes in the ideology are trying to find other ways to solve this unjust. I hope so.
Yeah, like what other
Hmm?
ways? What other ways? Like
Politics, joining the government, working in NGOs. I know loads of NGOs that are working to try and, you know, like, I won't say solve the conflict, but people to people methods, grassroots communication. There's loads of other methods that are working, and loads of very intelligent and charismatic people are contributing to that. Unfortunately, it's very, very, very difficult in terms of normalization and in terms of what you can and you can't do today, and in terms of um, the frustration that people has. It's not easy.
Hmm. If we talk about sorry, psychosocial theories, right? There is a whole string. I just wrote down some of them. Yeah? Negative identity hypothesis, narcissist rage hypothesis, rational choice theory, yeah, social movement theory, orthodox terrorism theory, radial terrorism theory, moderate terrorism theory, drive theory. Drive theory is interesting because you have this frustration aggression hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
Then we have the relative deprivation theory. We could talk about that. Yeah.
Mhm.
And we have this, well, there are more than that, but there's still the strain theory. Yeah. All try to kind of, explain terrorism, right? Which goes back again to some degree to the definition. Yeah. The field is so divided, right? That to really find a comprehensive, I mean, you could argue definition, what's the relevant of a real definition, yeah, but if you want to come to a real structural counterterrorism strategy, you have to have these kind of things, right? So that makes it a bit difficult.
I think that all these theories are really, really helpful in explaining to us how to understand terrorism. I mean, in my courses, it is very important for me that student will, be familiar with these theories. For example, rational choice theory. That is super, super important because, I mean, though I don't believe in that theory, I don't agree with that at all, but it is important to understand that, are terrorists rational? Can they make their choices from a completely rational, place? Um, I don't believe it. I don't believe that any of us is completely rational. I think that none of us can be absolutely objective, and we all come with a specific um, uh, like thing, background, and moral compass, and beliefs, and education, and everything that is um, shaped us to who we are today, and we can't completely disregard that. And there's a lot of criticism about my work as an Israeli Jewish woman that is researching, Palestinians in prison. And I said, look, I'm not trying to be objective. I'm not objective. I am Israeli, and I am Jewish, and I am female, and that's who I am. But I'm also very professional, and I won't make any argument unless I can prove it, and unless I can base it like a million times. Um, so it makes me a lot more professional because I'm not trying to, again, to ignore who I am. I'm not a computer. Um, but I think that from where I come from, I do I do use it. I do use, my background because, for example, my family come from Yemen. My grandparents were kicked out of Yemen in the 50s and came to Israel. And so I know the feeling of, being an immigrant, and being kicked out of your place because you don't belong there, and because you don't serve the interest of the people in the place where you live. And my family speak Arabic, and so I'm Middle Eastern. That's who I am. I can understand the culture. I can understand the religion. I can understand, everything that involves in this crazy hot, region. Um, and and I can still see, how they think from their own perspective, not mine. when I profile someone, when I work on a case, I can never, diagnose someone or profile someone from my own perspective, from where I come from, because that's not genuine. That's not true. Um, that won't I won't be able to understand that person mindset if I'll judge someone according to my beliefs and my values, because he comes from a different place, from different values, different beliefs, and I have to understand him and not myself. So so it is kind of tricky, but it also, after 20 years of doing it, even more than 20 years, God, I'm old, I can definitely, when I'm at work, and I don't think as myself. I think as a Hamas member, or I think as a Daesh member, because I can't think from my own perspective. It just doesn't work like that.
It's very rare that you find somebody who practices self-reflection in the sense you just did. Yeah. I mean, you and me, we both know that more than 90% of all our decisions are based on emotions, and we use our neocortex, our ratio, to justify the decisions that our emotions made. Yeah. We are also victim, we are falling victim to a myriad of cognitive biases, yeah, programs which we inherited throughout generations,
Yeah.
that still work like they worked in ancestral times. Yeah.
Yeah, there's lots of criticism against what I'm
Yeah.
saying. A lot of researchers thinks that terrorism is absolutely rational, that terrorists are rational people that commit acts out of, like, thinking the pros and cons of their actions, and believing that, violence is the right way because it gives them, their best interest. Um, but I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, they're coming, especially Palestinians, they are born into a certain circumstances, since their birth, or even before that, that's in their DNA. They are born into this deprivation, this national deprivation, social deprivations. Um, um, they feel that they have been, disgraced, and they're being humiliated, and that's how they, that is their national grievances, and that's how it's, developed. And as kids, little kids, that's what they aspire. And I'm not saying that they're all, going to this violence, way eventually, but they definitely are being shaped by these grievances. um, Thankfully, a lot of them, don't choose violence as a way to solve their issues. But I have lots of Palestinian colleagues, and this is something that will never change. um, I, I I don't think so. I'm a very optimistic person, but I don't think that this humiliation is something, especially in the Arab community, that honor is something that is very, very substantial. Um, I think I don't know how many generations we'll have to to go through, and until this humiliation will be fade.
I can't resist asking the question, yeah, because you spoke about national grievances, yeah. As a scientist, right? Not as a person, but as a scientist, do you feel that there's some valid national grievances on the part of the Palestinian population?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm not saying it as, a fake or something. They all suffer from very strong national grievances.
Yeah.
The fact that they still don't have, a state, that they still don't have a place where, I mean, they, of course, they call it Palestine, and they have very, you know, their culture, and religion, and it's very strong. I think one of the reasons that the profile of Palestinian terrorists is different than the Daesh terrorism is that strong identity. Because one of the problems of all these foreign fighters was an identity crisis. And Palestinians don't have identity crisis. That might, like, maybe these days it's a bit, I've heard some of my Palestinian colleagues says that they're starting to have some, issues with identity, but in general, they do have a very strong Palestinian identity with their culture and food and all kinds of things that unites them as Palestinians. And that is something that is very strong for them. So I do believe that it does serve as as a positive aspect for them as a society. But on the other hand, it makes their grievance, very social one. Um, and in the fact that they don't know even when that will change, that is something that I think very, very frustrating for a lot of them.
Yeah. I would like to discuss profiling a little bit more in a moment, um, in a way that could help law enforcement in general. Yeah, so that's really on my list, because I know from the conversation that we had, there's definitely some interesting information that you could provide. Yeah, but I would like to kind of conclude the issue of the root cause. Yeah. So when we talk about root cause, it's like with evolutionary psychology. Yeah? If you investigate some deviant behavior, then you're very quickly accused of justifying it. Yeah? Same thing here. You even discussing the root cause of terrorism is a tricky one, because people very quickly put you in this corner. You are justifying terrorism, which is not really the core. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
because
Why
the
do you want to understand them? Why do you?
yeah,
I've heard that so many times.
yeah. So some scientists feel uncomfortable with that concept because it removes the moral superiority, right? And very briefly, I have a note here. The United Nations General Assembly in 1958 already passed a resolution that identified colonialism, racism, and violation of human rights as the underlying cause of terrorism, right? So this is a total different approach than looking at psychopathology or character traits. We didn't even discuss character traits. Yeah, also such a fairy tale. Yeah, the big five are responsible for terrorism. Yeah, but if you look at it in this way, is that something that you find in your research, that political reasons are contributing, or let's just say are a contributing factor to terrorism?
Look, I don't believe that there is one one thing that contributes to someone being a terrorist. I think that there's loads of variables that come into place altogether. um, and different people, you know, are shaped differently, and different variables affect them, and their decision making process in terms of what they choose to be um, as terrorists. And every case that I work on, I do check all the variables. I will check the psychopathology first to disclose it. I will check, the political aspect. I will check the background. I will check the education. I will check the religion. I will check the circumstances. I will check everything because it's very, very holistic. And different people have different approaches. And when I build a timeline for every case that I work on, I do check on that timeline what were the most substantial issues and events and people that contributed to that person development, and how it shaped in a certain way that at the end, where he got to the point when he need to decide whether to commit an act of terrorism or not, I'll know where he stands. I know what led him to do that. And when I'm going with him on this timeline and I'm experiencing the experiences that he has, eventually when I get there, I can understand it. I can understand why he's there and why he didn't choose otherwise. And sometimes it can be a combination of circumstances with certain deprivations, people that he knows, and traumatic events he experiences, all together, that push him to do that. And on the other hand, he can have one positive contribution that will lure him to forget all this, variables, and to choose something else. And that's amazing, because we're human beings, and we're on a survival mode, and we're like, every time that I need to assess, someone's risk, I'm always looking for these protective items. Did he have something good in his life, like, that will be, will serve as a protective item to lure him from these, violent decision. Um, and sometimes all you need is one protective items that will help you do that.
To summarize, before we go into profiling, yeah, to summarize, to some extent, you already gave the answer, but you gave a very broad answer. Yeah? But I think you do this now for 20 years, I believe, right? Almost 20 years. Yeah. If you
A
could
bit more.
summarize, and taking into consideration that this whole scene, if so to speak, has changed. Yeah. But what would be, in a nutshell, your response to the answer? What's the root cause of contemporary Palestinian terrorism? I know it's a tricky
it's
one. I know.
it's a very tricky one, but it's mostly a combination of national grievances with social grievances, and frustration from, the circumstances and experiences on a daily basis, this consequences of this conflict. um, if you can move away from it, some people do have the opportunities to go abroad, to study abroad, to experience different experiences, then you most likely, won't go through that trade of terrorism. But if you're living, like, right in the hub of the conflict, and you're involved in it, and you're very active, and your family is very active, and it will be very, very hard to disattach from it.
Completely understand. Yeah, and you were politically sensitive, but also very, very transparent. I completely understand your answer. Okay.
Okay.
If we go into profiling, yeah, and the first thing is rapport building, right? I have Lena Sisko, for example. I interviewed. She was an interrogator on Guantanamo. I interviewed Robin Drake. He was from, or is from, the FBI's counterterrorism, yeah, and Jack Schaefer. He was also in FBI's behavior analysis program, the original one. Yeah, and with all of them, I discussed the necessity of rapport building in these kind of adverse situations and how they did it. So I'm asking you also. You're going into an interview with a hostile enemy combatant. I'm not sure if that's the legally correct term in that circumstance. Anyway, it's a hostile environment, at least at first, right? This person doesn't know you, you don't know the person. He may or may not perceive you as a direct enemy, being an Israeli. Yeah. So how do you manage this? Because I saw in the transcripts that are in your PhD, it seems to me that some of them, they were quite open. Yeah. How did you manage this?
Well, I find it to be very, very useful for me to be an outsider, because most of the locations, like if it's prison, or if it's very security based, environment, and automatically they become a lot more suspicious, and so being an outsider is very helpful. I'm not wearing uniforms. I'm not one of the security or intelligence
You're
personnel.
still Israeli for them.
I am Israeli, but I'm a woman. And most of the cases I present myself as a researcher, as a student, because a lot of my work relates to that. If I'm a risk assessor, sometimes I interview as a risk assessor. So it's also something that can benefit them. So as far as they concern, I'm not hostile, and I'm there as an outsider that is interested in them. Even my questions and what I'm interested in is completely different than what they're used to being asked by intelligence, for example. So when I'm in the room, um, it's changed. The dynamic changes. Okay, they feel a lot more comfortable. They're a lot more relaxed. I can also sense, like for example, if I'm in the room with my colleagues, okay, it's completely different if I'm in the room or if I'm not in the room. Because if I'm not in the room and it's all male, environment, the atmosphere is different. If I'm in the room, it's completely different. They feel a lot more comfortable, a lot more relaxed. The conversation is going differently. My questions are much more interested in them. Tell me about yourself, and so immediately that changes everything. And I found it to be very, very useful. Um, and
So that's what you're
and
talking
I'm
about is the setting. So the setting you described, yeah, but on a psychological level,
technological level.
psychological level.
Psychological. Again, it's the same because I'm always saying it to my students, and it's very funny because I'm working, with terrorists, and beforehand I worked with very, very, extreme criminals. But me myself, in my personality, I'm very, very naive person. I believe everything you tell me. I like immediately see the good in the person in front of me. It doesn't matter if he's a sex offender or like a serial killer. I immediately attach to what's good in you, and I believe you. I believe your story. I believe what you're telling me. And for many years, I thought that I'm in a wrong profession, because the people I work with are so, antisocial and so extreme in their behavior. But eventually, I realized that because I'm not faking the fact that I believe them, they can sense that I truly believe in them. They can sense that the person is sitting in front of them is genuine. So it makes them open up in ways that you won't even understand. It makes them feel a lot more comfortable because I don't fake it. Um, like, some interrogators or some, they pretend to be nice, but, they're very smart. They know that they're not. So they still tense, they still feel uncomfortable. But it's not the same with me. Like immediately they feel very comfortable, immediately they open up in ways that you won't even believe. So I'm I'm very transparent. I'm very open. I'm immediately, saying who I am, why I'm there for, and I think it's very efficient in that respect. So the information I receive is it's mostly genuine, and if not, then I do go and I check it out. I don't, because I'm that naive. I don't trust myself, so I go and I check everything out. Um, and I mean, especially with terrorists, they do they really really believe in what they're doing, so they want to show me how truthful they are. So it's mostly like that. That's how I find it.
Two observations. Yeah, what you said, you believe almost everything. Yeah, you are no exceptions. Yeah, so we know
Hmm.
from research, of course. First of all people are very bad when it comes to deception detection, and that includes most of the law enforcement. I'm pretty sure you're aware of the studies. It's like flipping a coin. It's like 50-50, basically. Yeah. That's aside, yeah. But in terms of believing everything, yeah, in evolutionary terms, it makes absolute sense, right? We as a human race would not have been able to evolve if we question anything or everything or most of the things that people tell us. No, you know,
Mm.
yes, sometimes we are betrayed, being lied to, yeah. But overall, it was in our evolutionary benefit to believe that most of the time, most people tell us the truth. That's very much ingrained in our system, yeah. And it's
Yeah,
even
but not your work. If you work in security,
I spoke
the
with
people
some,
I work with, they're
yeah,
so like
yeah.
they're used to people lying to them, so they're very, very suspicious,
Yeah.
very
So
paranoid.
we have the truth bias and we have the lie bias. Yeah. Most people
Yeah.
are falling under the truth bias. Yeah. And I talked to somebody who told me from law enforcement, also law enforcement is under the truth bias only to a lesser degree. Yeah. So they're not on the lie bias. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's a different one. Yeah. But the second observation I wanted to share is I saw in your thesis that you are relying to a large extent on self-reports, right? So from research, we know self-reports is a bit tricky because I don't have a correct image of myself. Yeah, nobody has a really objective image of him or herself. Yeah. So I was wondering, and I saw also that, of course, you have the files, you have the history, and so on. So how what's the stronger weight for you?
There are two, it's a very good question because there are two ways that I look at it. The first thing is that before every interview I conduct, I study the person very well.
What are you looking for? Specifics, please.
I learn everything about the person, his background, everything that happens to him, everything that, like personality, everything. So when I finally speak with him, I know exactly when he's truthful and when he's not. And it's easy for me to see what he's trying to sell. And that's the second point. Because for me as a profiler, the truth or the lies that people are saying are not really relevant. I want to learn the story that a person is telling about himself. Because we all tell stories about ourselves, right? And that is what I'm interested in. It doesn't have to be completely lie or completely true, but it's how you want the world to see you. And that is super important for me in order to understand where that person is in terms of his mindset. I know if he's lying, but sometimes I don't really care because I can understand from this lie where he see himself. And that's what I need. So it the self-report for me are exactly what I need. Again, it's not that I don't think that they don't lie, whatever. Doesn't matter for me. Doesn't matter. Because, for example, if you need to do something that is not really goes in line with your self-conscious, okay,
Cognitive dissonance. Yeah.
you will find a way to neutralize your conscience. So you will start telling yourself a story that will back up your ability to do this. So the people I work with, the story that they are telling themselves is that they're the savior of their people, that they're doing it in order to save their families. That's completely neutralizing conscience. Completely. Because if you think that you sacrifice yourself so your kids will have better life, you can do almost everything, right? Doesn't matter how violent it is, but it's justified because you're sacrificing your life for your kids. So, as far as I'm concerned, I need to understand how you justify what you're doing, what the story you're telling yourself, and how you manage to neutralize your conscience. What is your motivation to do that? So, the self reports are absolutely perfect for me in that respect. And again, I do use a lot more information rather than only the self-report. That's not enough for me. And bear in mind, most of the work I do, not most, but a lot of the work that I do a lot of cases that I can't even interview the person. I mean, I do a lot of work on leaders that I can't meet, that I need to understand in order to, give advice to how to work with them, how to manage them, perpetrators that have escaped or that nobody can find them. I need to understand them without communicating with them. So in many of my cases, I don't have an access to these people, and I still need to profile them, and I still need to assess them from information that I have, and that a completely different method of working, which is also good because it's very clean, because sometimes meeting the person can get you a bit, we call it dirty. You know what I mean?
Biased.
Um,
Yeah.
um, so it's two different ways, and I think both are really good with their pros and cons. And you need to make the best out of both of them.
Yeah. I should have probably asked this earlier. Yeah. What's the purpose of profiling terrorists? I mean, the self-explanatory answer. There are some self-explanatory answers on the surface, yeah, but I'm sure there's more.
Yeah, well, terrorist profiling is something that developed from criminal profiling, because at the beginning it started only with criminals, which, rightly so. Criminals have a lot of psychopathology involved, and profiling is, needs that in order to develop. Um, and with terrorism, it was a bit contradicting because we didn't really have the definition of terrorism, so what you're profiling, and B, especially as we discussed earlier, there was no psychopathology. So what's the point of profiling someone? Because if he's committing an act, he will gladly just announce that he committed it. So why do you need to profile him? Because you have him in front of you. He's not going anywhere. He's not trying to escape. So at the beginning, it was very controversial. We didn't people didn't really think that it's actually viable. But I found it here in Israel, because unlike the US and other places, we don't really have a lot of serial criminals here in Israel, so criminal profiling is not very developed here. But we do have a lot of terrorism going on, and we do need to understand it better. And profiling is the best way to go deep into someone's mindset and understand how he functions and how he operates. And we need to negotiate with them, and we need to communicate with them. And sometimes we do need to find them, and sometimes we do need to counter them. And doing it just on a military basis is completely wrong. I mean, okay, I will be a bit more gentle. It's not completely wrong, but it's not holistic. It's not enough. And we can see that it's not like that successful. Okay. Uh, you need to do things better. And since I moved back to Israel 6 years ago, and I started developing that method of profiling in the field of terrorism here in the army and the intelligence services, it's changed a lot. It's changed a lot, how we perceive, how we gather information, how we understand the threat, how we manage the threat. And I think it's amazing because, as I said, terrorism has changed. We need to change as well. And B, the threat is very, very dynamic. And if we won't understand that, then we will continue just firing at everyone.
Okay, so what are again? I know this is a very broad topic and there's a lot of information. Yeah, but again, keeping law enforcement in the back, general law enforcement in the back of our minds. Yeah, what could what benefits could what valuable information uh, could a person like you give to law enforcement when it comes to profiling? Yeah? And I think we need to make a distinction here between, let's say, a prisoner or a terrorist that you have already in captivity, because I clearly can see why this is of benefit of profiling that person, versus, for
Yeah,
example, profiling a person that you have no access to because the person
yeah,
maybe is not in prison, like
yeah,
predicting behavior, etc., etc. If you
yeah.
can encapsulate a couple of those
So
things.
exactly. So most of my work is or with perpetrators that commit an act and escape. So I come to the scene and I'm assisting, the security personnel to understand the person that has escaped, was what the level of risk that he poses. Is he going to commit an act again soon? When? How his mindset works right now? What is he going to do? Where can they find him? So I had quite a lot of cases that I was involved in, that it was easier for me to give answers that they couldn't see. So, if there is psychopathology involved, then that's that is easier. Like I had a case where someone that actually, slaughtered people twice and escaped, and we knew who he is, but we couldn't find him. And from diagnosing his disorder, I don't want to expand too much, diagnosing his disorder, I was able to determine exactly where he will be. And I told him where he will be. They went there and he was there. And that was like, they couldn't even think about it. So that's like an example of one case. Another case is where I am profiling leaders of groups that we work with, Hamas, Fatah. And if we have different incidents with, with the organization, then I can advise on how to deal according to the decision making of the leader. I can advise on how to work out, the counter measures against that leader. So it can be, very efficient even when I don't interview the prisoners, or but helping manage the threat, or helping catch the offender. I think one of the example I gave at the conference, I don't know if you remember, with one that committed an act, shooting a soldier um, at one point at a checkpoint, and escaped. And it was very helpful that I came to the scene and I profiled, the person, and I knew exactly what his next moves are going to be. And I advised on how to deal with that specific threat. Um, so yeah, I mean, having so many years of experience and different events that I had to deal with allows me to see every, case that I need to deal with. I can already, immediately see where this person is coming from, and how he thinks. I know the areas, I know the cultures. So if he comes from that specific area, I know how the culture is, what he thinks, how he thinks. And if it's from a different culture, I know how that works. So here it's my comfort zone. I did have to deal with, cases that are outside of my comfort zone. um, I don't know, a serial killer in the United States once that I had to deal with, in Europe, from cultures that I'm not really familiar with. And then I had to, start from scratch. I need to learn the culture and I need to learn about the environment, the circumstances. but the method is the same. So I have the general method. I just need to put in line the information.
I don't want to overstay my welcome too long, but maybe one practical example, because it struck me what you just said. A terrorist committing an act of terrorism and you profiling the scene. I interviewed a CID commander, Criminal Investigation Division or Department. It's a military strain of, and he was focusing on crime scene profiling. So I know you cannot go into specifics of that specific case, but in general, if you don't have the perpetrator's name, if you don't know who it was, you have the crime scene. What specific are you looking for, and what deduction can you make from what you find?
So there's many things that I takes from the criminal profiling. Okay, how the scene is being, left after the perpetrator has gone. Organized, disorganized, says a lot about the perpetrator. I also look at the how he committed the act. Okay, what kind of tools he used, how he behaved during the act. I mean, I do interview witnesses, and I'm trying to get as much information as I can on the scene and on the behavior of that perpetrator that will allows me to understand who committed it. I did have quite a few events when there was even a unit that committed an act, um, and escaped, and I needed to understand that specific unit. And I could see from the scene a lot about that unit, and not just from the scene. The I combine the scene with what I know about the area. So what kind of groups works in the area? What is the culture of the groups that works in the area? Are they professional? Are they amateur? What kinds of weapon they use? Um, so you add the knowledge that you already have about the area and about the timing and about everything that you can manage from what you already know and with what you've seen in the scene. So I had, for example, one event that happened in Jerusalem that, according to what was there, I knew immediately what kind of organization committed it. And the intelligence told me, "You're crazy. Like, we didn't even start the investigation." And I said, "No, this all, very, very, linked with how this group is operating." And it took them 3 weeks to finalize the investigation. And they called me and they said, "We have no idea how you knew it, but it was exactly, what you said." And I said, "I don't know why it took you 3 weeks, but yes, I mean, so it's a combination of experience, knowledge of the scene and the culture, and what you see in the scene. I think it's the combination. And again, it's a difference between the top down and bottom up. If you sent me to Japan to I'll start from the bottom, but here in my comfort zone, then I'm definitely top down.
Now, my last question. I have two more questions. One is for you. Yeah. The last question will be: did we neglect to discuss anything that you would like to discuss? But before we do, if you would, and it's a kind of political question, yeah. If you would advise your government, the Israeli government, and I don't mean necessarily the current government, yeah. Let's just say the government, for a potential solution, you as a scientist, based on all your research, for the Israel-Palestine conflict, would you have any suggestion for your government?
Wow. um Look, I think that it's at this stage, there's no magic here. There's not like one solution that will fit all. um we need to start a new process because there is no trust between the two people. There is nobody believes in anything the other one is saying or doing. It's very tense these days. So I think we will need to start a whole new process of building trust, which relates to education, both sides. Yeah. What you tell your kids about the conflict, what you tell your kids about the people, equality, how you treat people. Okay. It's not a secret that even Arab Israelis feel like second class citizens in this country, and Palestinians, of course. I think the leadership among the Palestinians, I don't even know how to tackle that one, but they have a deficit of proper leaders that will actually serve the people best interests rather than themselves. So it has to be education, it has to be leadership, it has to be politics, it has to be, normalization. Normalization is lacking. There is so much hate among people here, both sides. So there's a lot to be done, and I think it will take forever. I ask my colleagues that are, they're called Arabists because they are specialized on the language and the culture. And I ask them if they think that there is a way of, having peace between the people. And they don't think so. They think that because of the different religion and culture that based basically on honor and um, and respect, then the Arabs will never forgive the shame and humiliation that we caused them in 48 and then in 67. Um, and they don't think it will change. I would like to be a bit more optimistic, and I believe that people don't want to live on their swords forever. It might not happen in my generation, probably won't happen in my generation or in the next 2 or 3 generations, but eventually people will get tired. No? I mean, we had so many other huge conflicts in the world that nobody thought will ever end, and eventually they have, in Europe. And so I would prefer to stay optimistic in that respect.
Yeah, your answer is very similar. So I have interviewed Professor Benny Morris, who is one of the new historians. It was a very interesting interview. I have interviewed Noam Chomsky on that topic. I've interviewed Miko Pelet twice. I guess you know
Okay.
who it is. When I asked the question, everybody's pessimistic. Yeah, everybody is at this stage really concerned and pessimistic. But
Yeah.
I felt a little positive note at the end what you said. You know,
Yeah.
there were long conflicts, and somehow humanity has found a way
Yeah.
to deal with them. Yeah. And now I'm coming to the question what I already announced. Did we neglect to discuss anything that's close to your heart?
Um, well, I think since I got involved in the whole idea of profiling, um, I find it very sad that, and I have no idea how to change that. But when people hear about profiling, immediately they think, about the negative consequences of profiling, and they don't see it in a very, positive way. And I always find myself trying to justify it, why profiling is important and why I do it, not because, of a racial profiling, but only because I'm interested in understanding people better. I love people, and I'm fascinated by people. Doesn't matter who they are. As far as I'm concerned, like, getting to know people for me is treasure. And 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 I think that I would love to be able to change that perception of profiling, and especially in Israel, in relation with terrorism. I hope that it will change something, um, in terms of the conflict, and how people see, others, and that's what I'm trying to do. And I hope that when I'll manage to settle these things and in the profession, then I'll be able to try and find ways to get more people to do that, because at the moment it's only me, as far as I know, and it's not easy.
Wow. You're right. Profiling is a relatively young science. As
Yeah,
as with evolutionary psychology, right? It's also relatively
yeah,
young critics, and I would say in academia, progress proceeds one funeral at a time, right? So it takes a while. Out of curiosity, you have kids?
yes, I have an
Okay,
8-year-old daughter.
okay. So you are invested emotionally, of course, in the future of your country, right?
Of course,
Yeah.
of course, and I mean, I'm coming from a very big family. They're all religious, so it's part of, having lots of kids. And also being religious, they're also very right wing. And it's very, very difficult. So, it helps me understand, because I'm coming from there, from the religion. I was religious for many years, so I understand the root of, living on believing that this land is historically ours, and we have the right, on this land. I can completely understand where they're coming from, and it's very, very difficult. I can't speak with my own family about, the conflict, because I can't change their mindset. So, I mean, what am I doing? um, but yeah, we love each other anyway. We respect each other anyway, and I think that's what we need to do with the Palestinians as well. We don't have
Very,
to agree, but we need to respect each other's mindset. So
very wise words at the end of this interview, Sajid. Really, I think respect is a good starting point. You're absolutely
absolutely,
right. Okay,
absolutely.
okay. Sajid, thank you very much for your time. Yeah, it was an incredible interview. Again, I saw you
Yeah,
speaking. I knew you have something to say on this topic. Um, I wish you all the best. I promise you will hear from me again, either way. Okay.
no problem at all, Thomas. Thank you so much for having me.
It,
And yeah, it was a pleasure. It was very privileged. Thank you.
likewise. Thank you. Bye.